Jasper, and today we're going to be reading Chapter 10 of The Princess and the Goblin. You ready? Pairing with today's story, I will be having a great big cup of coffee! As always, pour yourself something yummy to drink, relax, enjoy, and cheers. Chapter 10, The Princess's King Papa. The weather continued fine for weeks, and the little princess went out every day. So long a period of fine weather had indeed never been known upon that mountain. The only uncomfortable thing was that her nurse was so nervous and particular about being in before the sun was down, that often she would take to her heels when nothing worse than a fleecy cloud crossing the sun threw a shadow on the hillside, and many an evening they were home a full hour before sunlight had left the weathercock on the stables. If it had not been for such behavior, Irene would have, by this time, almost forgotten about the goblins. She never forgot Curdie, but him she remembered for his own sake, and indeed would have remembered him if only because a princess never forgets her debts until they are paid. One splendid sunshiny day, about an hour after noon, Irene, who was playing on a lawn in the garden, heard the distant blast of a bugle. She jumped up with a cry of joy, for she knew by that particular blast that her father was on his way to see her. This part of the garden lay on the slope of the hill and allowed a full view of the country below. So she shaded her eyes and with her hand and looked far away to catch the first glimpse of shining armor. In a few moments, a little troop came glittering round and shoulder of a hill. Spears and helmets were sparkling and gleaming, banners were flying, horses prancing, and again came the bugle blast, which was to her like the voice of her father calling across the distance. "Irene, I'm coming!" On and on they came, until she could clearly distinguish the king. He rode a white horse and was taller than any of the men with him. He wore a narrow circle of gold set with jewels around his helmet, and as he came still nearer, Irene could discern the flashing of the stones in the sun. It was a long time since he had been able to see her, and her little heart beat faster and faster as the shining troop approached. For she loved her King Papa very dearly, and was nowhere so happy as in his arms. When they reached a certain point, after which she could see them no more from the garden, she ran to the gate, and there stood till up they came clanging and stamping, with one more bright bugle blast which said, "Irene, I am come." But this time the people of the house were all gathered at the gate, but Irene stood alone in front of them. When the horsemen pulled up, she ran to the side of the white horse and held up her arms. The king stooped and took her hands. In an instant she was on the saddle and clasped in his great strong arms. I wish I could describe the king so that you could see him in your mind. He had gentle blue eyes, but a nose that made him look like an eagle. A dark beard streaked with silvery lines flowed from his mouth almost to his waist, and as Irene sat on the saddle and hid her glad face upon his bosom, it mingled with the golden hair which her mother had given her, and the two together were like a cloud with streaks of the sun woven through it. After he had held her to his heart for a minute, he spoke to his white horse, and the great beautiful creature, which had been prancing so proudly a little while before, walked as gently as a lady, for he knew he had a little lady on his back. Through the gate and up the door of the house, then the king set her on the ground, and dismounting, took her hand and walked with her into the great hall, which was hardly ever entered, except when he came to see his little princess. There he sat down, with two of his counselors who accompanied him, to have some refreshment, and Irene bestowed herself on his right hand and drank her milk out of a wooden bowl curiously carved. After the king had eaten and drunk, he turned to the princess and said, stroking her hair, "Now, my child, what shall we do next?" This was his question he almost always put to her first after their meal together, and Irene had been waiting for it with some impatience, for now she thought she should be able to settle a question which constantly perplexed her. "I should like you to take me to see my great old grandmother." The king looked grave and said, What does my little daughter mean? I mean the Queen Irene that lives up in the tower. The very old lady, you know, with the long silver hair. The king only gazed at his little princess with a look which she could not understand. She's got a crown in her bedroom, she went on, but I've not been in there yet. You know she's here, don't you? No, said the king very quietly. Then it must be all a dream, said Irene. I half thought it was, but I couldn't be sure. Now I am sure of it. Besides, I couldn't find her the next time I went up. At that moment, a snow-white pigeon flew in at an open window, and, with a flutter settled upon Irene's head, she broke into a merry laugh, cowered a little, and put up her hands to her head, saying, Dear Dovey, don't peck me. You'll pull out my hair with your long claws, if you don't have a care. The king stretched out his hand to take the pigeon, but it spread its wings and flew away again through the open window, where its whiteness made one flash in the sun and vanished. The king laid his hand on the princess's head, held it back a little, gazed in her face, smiled half a smile and sighed half a sigh. Come, my child, we'll have a walk in the garden together, he said. You won't come up and see my huge, great, beautiful grandmother then, King Papa? Said the princess. Not this time, said the king very gently. She has not invited me, you know, and great old ladies like her do not choose to be visited without leave asked and given. The garden was a very lovely place, being upon a mountainside. There were parts in it where the rocks came through in great masses, and all immediately about them remained quiet, wild. Tufts of heather grew upon them, and other hardy mountain plants and flowers, while near them would be lovely roses and lilies and all pleasant garden flowers. This mingling of the wild mountain with the civilized garden was very quaint, and it was impossible for any number of gardeners to make such a garden look formal and stiff. Against one of these rocks, with a garden seat, shadowed from the afternoon sun by the overhanging of the rock itself, there was a little winding path up to the top of the rock, and on the top another seat. But they sat upon the seat at its foot, because the sun was hot, and there they talked together of many things. At length the king said, You were out late one evening, Irene. Yes, Papa, it was my fault, and Ludi was very sorry. I must talk to Ludi about it, said the king. Don't speak loud to her, please, Papa, said Irene. She's been so afraid of being late ever since. Indeed, she has not been naughty. It was only a mistake for once. Once might be too often, murmured the king to himself as he stroked his child's head. I cannot tell you how he had come to know. I'm sure Curdie had not told him. Someone about the palace must have seen them, after all. He sat for a good while thinking. There was no sound to be heard except that of a little stream, which ran merrily out of an opening in the rock near where they sat, and sped away down the hill through the garden. Then he rose and, leaving Irene where she was, went into the house and sent for Ludi, with whom he had a talk that made her cry. When, in the evening, he rode away upon his great white horse, he left 6 of his attendants behind him, with orders that 3 of them should watch outside the house every night, walking round and round it from sunset to sunrise. It was clear he was not quite comfortable about the princess. So what I'd like to talk about today is the relationship between the princess and her father. It is notable that the relationship would be a difficult one. At the start of the chapter, he comes home, and at the close of the chapter, he leaves again. And while the briefness of his trip could indicate that Princess Irene doesn't see her father much, it could also indicate, given his worry with the princess, being out at night, that he came home out of his way, especially for his daughter. What we can see for certain is, number 1, the princess loves her father. She jumps for joy when she hears the bugle, which means he is coming home. Further, to her, the sound of that bugle is the sound of her father's voice saying, Irene, I've come home. Irene, I come home, which is a message particularly just for her. This idea that her father doesn't come home for the kingdom and her, but the father comes home firstly and always for her. And further, we see her unbounding joy and happiness, her love within her father, when he comes home and she sees him and she runs in front of everyone else, stretches out her arms because she knows he will always come and pick her up. The second thing that is clear is that her father loves her. In front of all of his men and his people, he scoops her up without hesitation and he holds her close to his heart. He doesn't make any proclamation to the people. He doesn't say anything to his men. His attention is only on his daughter. And 3, it is clear that their relationship is one of mutual love and almost equality. Though there are some notable differences in power because it's the relationship between an adult and a child, the father listens to her concerns and hears out her voice. We see this first in the routine that the narrator mentions they have. That he comes home, Irene jumps up on his horse, he brings her into this great hall, they eat together, and after they've eaten, he asks her always the same question: what is it you'd like to do next? We also see this when Princess Irene asks about her great-great-grandmother. It is clear by her father's reaction that he knows about the great-great-grandmother, but not that she was there. And it seems as if he's holding something back, something he perhaps doesn't want Irene to know about. However, he doesn't go to lengths to say that the great-great-grandmother doesn't exist or wasn't there or it was something imagined, even at the point in which Irene gives him a perfectly good out and says, maybe it was a dream. Yeah, it was a dream. He acknowledges that the great-great-grandmother is a person and simply that he didn't know she was there. And so although he doesn't tell her everything he knows, he also doesn't conceal what she's already found out to be true for herself. Then, concerning Ludi, we see a fairly frank conversation in which he says, "You were out late one night." And the princess takes responsibility for that night, saying it was her fault and Ludi was very sorry. The father then says that he still needs to talk to Ludi. And the princess again advocates for Ludi's sake, saying, please don't talk to her loudly. The father doesn't retort with things like, you're a child, you don't understand, or getting angry with her, or dismissing her concerns. He seems to really, truly listen to her. And when he goes to talk to Ludi, it's something that I kind of wonder about and think that he did perhaps take into account the things that his daughter has said concerning Ludi. As always, I hope whatever you've been drinking has been good, that the story and conversation have been a fair match. Cheers and cheers.